Externalities of production. Just as we did when we looked at externalities of consumption, let's start out in studying externalities of production by recalling the basics we learned in earlier chapters about how firms decide what to produce. Firms determine from their supply schedule by determining whether the cost of producing an extra unit of the good exceeds the revenue that they get from it. But one thing we've never considered before was whether someone else might have to pay some of the costs associated with producing the good. If someone else has to pay some of the costs of production, that's referred to as a negative externality of production. Here's a few examples. A factory dumps wastes from its production into a river, and the government has to pay part of the cleanup. Another factory emits smoke into the air. People get asthma from the smoke, and their health insurance company has to pay for them to get treatment. Someone builds a large apartment building across the street from your house, which blocks your view, increases traffic, and lowers the value of your house. Notice that in each of these examples, the firm creates a problem that someone else has to pay for. So the firm does not pay all the costs of production. It's almost like, in some cases, they got to use a resource for free, like clean water or clean air, because they forced someone else to pay for the cleanup. And just as with externalities of consumption, we can look at the negative externality of production problem using our supply and demand diagram. So when we have a negative production externality, firms do not take into account the additional production costs that they force others to pay. So as a consequence, if we were to compare society's supply curve with the private supply curve, the private supply is greater than society's supply because society has greater costs than the private firm takes into account. So we see here we have a private supply curve and the social supply curve. And notice that with the intersection of the private supply curve with the demand curve is at a greater quantity than the intersection of the social supply curve and demand curve. Therefore, in equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity of good is greater than it would be if we used the social supply curve. Essentially, once again, we're producing too much of this good, given the costs that actually exist, and not just the costs that the firm faces. There can also be positive externalities of production. Builders construct an attractive front to their building with grass and flowers in front of their building. The community enjoys the attractiveness of the building, but the builder doesn't take into account the enjoyment of other people when deciding whether to make these expenditures. As we'll see later, this is one reason why builders are sometimes required to meet certain standards by law. If there's a positive production externality, the situation with the supply curves is reversed. Essentially, the private firm isn't taking into account all the benefits it creates for society when deciding how much to produce. So its supply curve is less than that of society, and it is to the left of the social supply curve. And in equilibrium, the firm facing a positive externality will produce too little of the good compared to what the social optimum would be. We'll talk about positive externalities more when we talk about public goods later in this week's material.